All right, Karl, are you next? Yeah, Karl's next. Karl, where'd you go? Right behind me. He vanished. So Karl he's been on the job for a while now, so he's not brand new. He's older than Chris in terms of his tenure in the spot, but we'll hear from him now. Come on up.
All right. Hello, everybody. So my name is Karl Lund, as Andy has said, and I spent many a year here in Davis, and now I've continued on to the UC extension program. And as we often notice, we're not on schedule. And I won't be helping that out, of course. That is probably one of the things that Andy and most of us under Andy are very good at doing, is not staying on schedule. So while in Andy's lab, I worked on the Phylloxera problem. I was not the first person on the Phylloxera problem. Was I the last? Pretty close. So I was pretty close to the last. We did quite a bit of work. And Phylloxera have been, of course, a thorn in the side of viticulture for many years. And of course, Andy has this wonderful network. So these are some of pictures from Jeffrey Granite that he did from a history of Phylloxera. And Phylloxera first found their way from the US East Coast, where they're native, over to Europe, and they caused some minor problems. They completely and totally destroyed the French grapevine industry and eventually around the world. Now, California was not long behind them. Our first Phylloxera was found in 1873, and it killed own-rooted vinifera. And then, of course, we replanted on AXR number 1. And that worked for a little bit. And then, of course, we found biotype B, as Glenn just mentioned. And, well, it fell apart again. So first biotype B failure is marked down at 1983. And this select Phylloxera attack, I found this nice old article from the LA Times. It was marked down at $1 billion to replant all those AXR vineyards. So that's a lot of money now. That was, of course, a lot more money then. And I believe I once found that it was up to $4 billion to actually go through and do all that replanting, but I couldn't find that number anywhere, so we're just going to go with that $1 billion. Of course, this is also right when Andy Walker started his career. And he would end up contributing a lot to this problem. So if you actually just go into Google Scholar and punch Andy's name in with Phylloxera, you will find 2,500 results. Now, if you actually do it properly and put the little quotes around M.A. Walker, you'll find 384 results. Now, I did not go through and make sure that all of those were independent results and all of them, but you go through the first few pages, those are different articles, they're all very important, and the work that came out of Andy's lab was so vital for understanding the Phylloxera problem. Within these articles were also a large number of graduate students, including my work and many others that came before me. And Andy also likes to joke that the Phylloxera work is what sent his daughters to school, because there was a lot of money that came through because this was a big problem and it needed fixing. Wrong thing. So, my piece of the Phylloxera puzzle, when I started my PhD work, 10114 had really just started supporting large populations of Phylloxera. Now, 10114 had previously been much more resistant. It wasn't perfect. If I had an extra half hour up here, we could go into all my phenotypic work, but the biotype B and biotype A actually don't like 10114. Some of the new strains I identified do. Now, all that feeding was at the nodosity level, so it wasn't like this emergency, but growers who had already just lived through that biotype B AXR fiasco were like, uh-oh, what's going on here? We also had a second problem with foliar Phylloxera. We're in the rootstock vineyards. Now, foliar Phylloxera, for those of you from the eastern half of the US, that's what you're used to seeing. California, it was very rare. So what was going on there? So I had a couple questions that Andy basically had me answer. Are these new Phylloxera? And where did these types come from? So the first thing we had to do is figure out what was going on in California. So we took a couple road trips. So Andy and I took a couple trips through Napa, up into Sonoma, and spent a day collecting with Rhonda Smith, who is not here. And this is where I first learned Andy knows everybody. There was not a vineyard we could go to where Andy didn't know somebody who was helping to show us around. And so Andy got to talk while I got to dig holes. And this was a great way to work things out. We also did some trips around Yolo County. And so I got to meet a bunch of people here and collect a bunch of Phylloxera. I also found out Andy really loves In-N-Out Burger. It was one of the few places he would go to. You know, nobody's perfect, but I will give him that In-N-Out is not the worst fast food in the world. So then we get to some actual work here, since nobody else has been showing a lot of data. So here we have the old Phylloxera types here. And here we have two new different types of Phylloxera. So the Phylloxera me and Andy went out and collected were genetically distinct. They were something new. They were something we hadn't picked up before. But the bigger question was, where did these Phylloxera come from? So we had to compare them to the native Phylloxera populations. So Andy said, let's just take a little road trip. So we flew to Boston, and we drove back to Dallas. And we didn't go in a straight line either. First we drove out to Ohio, then we drove back to the coast, and then we drove back to Oklahoma before finally shooting down into Texas. First off, Andy is an absolutely amazing driver. I could sleep like a baby every day while Andy drove because he was so consistent. It was wonderful. The eastern half of the U.S. is absolutely beautiful. For those of you that have gone out to the East Coast and stayed there, it is a beautiful area. The one area I will say I did not like was actually going up the Mississippi River plain. Right when you're next to the Mississippi River, it's kind of pretty, but the outer areas where it's all agriculture are not as much fun. The other thing, there are subways everywhere on the eastern half of the U.S. They are everywhere. And apparently, much like there's a bylaw that says every In-N-Out needs to have that X in the palm trees, there's also apparently a bylaw that says every Subway needs to have a chain link fence on the side or behind it where there are grapes growing on it. Because every day on this road trip, all the way from Boston down to Texas, we stopped at a Subway for lunch. There were grapevines on the fence to the side or behind the Subway, and there were Phylloxera there. It was our most consistent place to find Phylloxera. So on top of my trip, I actually took a second trip myself, taking a friend out to Houston. So we actually drove through Arizona, and I collected a couple more samples, and down in Houston, Texas. And then, of course, Andy has this great network, and he does these trips quite often. So Dr. Heinitz, who's back here, and Dr. Riaz, who are back here and will be talking, they took a trip through Arizona and New Mexico and collected a bunch more samples. And then Dr. Cousins went through the Finger Lakes area. And then, was that you who did the sampling up by, in the northeast of New York? So I forgot who did those samples, but we have another walker who did some more sampling up here. And then we've got even more samples, and I didn't even remember who these samples all came from. The other fun thing that Andy did was he would even collect on trips. So Andy took a couple work trips down to Florida, and of course he's working. So yes, he brought some Phylloxera back. And then of course, He took a personal trip up to Utah, and even when he was on a personal family vacation, he still came back with a Phylloxera sample. Because apparently he just can't stop. So when we actually analyzed these samples, we found that there were a whole bunch of different populations, mainly based on host. But where did those actual samples from California come from? Well, those new rootstock populations in Napa, those came from the northeast off Vitis riparia. And then we had two populations that were actually hybrids. So we had the biotype A and biotype B, which were hybrids between the riparia population and the Vulpina East population. And then those foliar Phylloxera were hybrids between riparia and Vulpina West. But wait a second, we often think about Phylloxera as asexual. They have clones of themselves. So if there are hybrids between populations, does that mean that Phylloxera are actually using sexual reproduction? Well, it turns out that they are, and it turns out that this was a great bit of information for me, because for me, I think of genetics as the outcome of sexual reproduction. And as it turns out, despite the fact that I am 40 years old, more than 40 years old now, I still have a high school sense of humor. So this was a great find for me that Phylloxera on the eastern half of the US were having sex, and and that my research was the one that found this out. So when we actually start looking at some of this data, so for this one here, this is your Hardy-Weinberg, your probability. If you're above 0.1, you can't reject that population being in Hardy-Weinberg. So not just were most of my Phylloxera samples in Hardy-Weinberg, they were fully in it. So they weren't just having sex, they were in Hardy-Weinberg. And oddly enough, you see this one population here actually rejects Hardy-Weinberg. Well, if you look at the F statistic there, that's not saying that they're not having sex, that's actually saying that they're inbreeding. So apparently, Arizona is the Alabama of Phylloxera, and they just keep it within the family. More interestingly, a place I just was, and a place I will actually have to go back and do presentations this afternoon, I did a bunch of sampling up at the Oakville Research Station. And I found a couple very interesting Phylloxera in the irrigation trial up there. And if you notice, we have our two populations on the outside. Well, this guy here and this guy here, they have one allele that's only found in the Napa A population, or Napa 1 population, and one allele that came from Napa 2. If we look at our DV3 locus, you notice they also, again, have a loci that comes from the Napa 2 population, and a loci that comes from the Napa 2 population. So it looks like the person who has a high school sense of humor actually found that even in California, Phylloxera are probably having sex. Which allowed me to write a paper with the word sex in the title, which is just about the highest thing you could get done. So I got to write this paper, and it won an ASEV Best Paper Award. And I thought, yay, this is proof that everybody else has the same perverted sense of humor as me, and they just wanted to give it an award for that. Well, as it turns out, no, that wasn't the thing. It turns out when Andy writes an important paper on Phylloxera, it is Andy and Phylloxera that get the Best Paper Awards. So while mine was the most recent Best Paper Awards, Andy's actually won other Best Paper Awards when he does momentous work on Phylloxera. So I had to check my self-fulfilling ego at the door, but hey, it was still fun. All right, this work had a lot of funding, so thank you to all those people. And thank you to Andy for putting up with me for all those years.